Welcome to the Power of Reading, a book review program that discusses the latest Catholic books. A book is a dream you hold in your hand. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome once again to the Power of Reading program, a book review program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul. In this program, The Power of Reading, we continue to introduce to you the important classical and latest Catholic books. And this program actually wants to promote and revive the reading culture in our society today, because we believe that reading has good and lasting effects on our faith as Christians and also in our everyday life. And we also realize that today there is a great decline in reading because of the age of modern technology, which has changed the way we have access to information. And this has led us, many of us, to think that books are no longer important, that they have been replaced by the modern communication technology. But we realize that after a few decades of the internet, the written word still stands tall. And even though we may have access to the internet, we realize that there is a special way of learning from books that we cannot achieve through the internet. So the Power of Reading program, a book review program, the job of this program is to make sure that we do not lose our reading culture, because the book is still one of the best inventions of the human person. And today we are going to continue our journey with the book we started last week, that is Body, Mind, and Spirit. And this is the book that is written by Brother Fergus Garrett. Brother Fergus Garrett is a Marist brother who wrote this book. And this book, Body, Mind, and Spirit, is an introduction to Christian psychology. I just want to do a recap as we begin our program today of what we did last week, especially to present again the chapters that are found in this book. And this book, we say that is actually divided into 12 chapters. It's divided into 12 chapters. I would just want to do an overview of these chapters so that especially those who did not listen to what we shared last week, they may have an idea of the book that we are reviewing today. So chapter 1 in this book, Body, Mind, and Spirit, an introduction to Christian psychology. The chapter 1 deals with what we call the human person experiences life. The human person experiences life, and it deals with the 4 observations that we make as human beings. The first being that we observe immediately we are born that actually we are in the world. We also observe, the second observation is that I am with others. And the third observation is also that we realize that we are in a spiritual world. The fourth observation is that I am in the presence of a supreme being. We realize there's something greater than us. And there's a fifth observation that I have to know myself. Chapter 2 deals with awareness, my self-awareness of deeper aspects. And here the author presents them as 4 methods. The first method is the outside and the inside. The second method is human activity. The third method is conscious and unconscious. Fourth method is beyond myself. Chapter 3 deals with the body, person, a body of bone and muscle. The body needs energy and renewal. The body has a transport system. The body has a communication system. The body has chemical messengers. The body has sensors. It has a defense system. And the person is inside that body. Then we have chapter 4 that deals with the human mind. It tells us about our memory, our intellect, our preconscious, subconscious, and unconscious. He also says something about dreaming and also about our woundedness, because whatever experience we have, it is registered in our mind. Chapter 5 deals with the human spirit, and here he talks about instincts, feelings, emotions. He also talks about enjoyment and sufferings. He talks about desires, attitudes, and habits. He also talks about free will, conscience, values. He talks about relationships, self-transcendence, and experience. Chapter 6 of this book, Body, Mind, and Spirit, an introduction to Christian psychology, deals with growth. That is, first of all, the first birth from the womb, the second birth, moving independently, the third birth, entering the peer group, the fourth birth, as a sexual person. Then he talks about stages and tasks. He talks about born-again Christian, searching for myself, human needs, moral development, and also faith development. Then chapter 7 deals with motivation, the questions that we ask about life, like what is really important. He also talks about levels of living. How do I live? What really motivates me and motivates my life? And chapter 8 deals with self-knowledge and self-acceptance. It talks about listening to myself, the courage to acceptance, deciding and acting, and of course, conversion. Then chapter 9 deals with issues of our gender, that is, she is female, he is male. He talks about genotype and phenotype. He talks about masculine and feminine. He talks about sexual feelings and emotions, psychosexual maturity, and he also deals with the areas of marriage and celibacy. Chapter 10 deals with the relationships. Here he starts with what we call the personality types. He talks about communication. He talks about defense mechanism. And he also talks about the relationship between a man and a woman. Chapter 11 talks about being healthy or unhealthy. And here he talks about the 9 types of growth or deterioration. He talks about neurosis and psychosis. He talks about dis-ease and disease, especially in the area of psychosomatic problems. He talks about the road to maturity, helping others. That means affirmation. And the last chapter, actually, the author of our book, Body, Mind, and Spirit, Brother Fergus Garrett, talks about Christian vocation, the call itself and the response, human motivation, consistency and inconsistency, holiness and apostolic effectiveness, and also he deals with the area of spiritual resources. So this is the book that we are reviewing today, that we began reviewing in our last week program. In our last week's program, actually, we were able to deal with the first 5 chapters of this book. We were able to deal with the first 5 chapters of this book. So today we shall start reviewing our book from chapter 6. We shall begin from chapter 6, the chapter that deals with the area of growth. So we are going to take our first break here at the Power of Reading program at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. And then we shall continue to see a bit about this book, because we feel that it is so important for us as we review this book just to have an overview of every chapter, so that we can help you to understand this book and to see the importance of having this book in your life. Let us take a break as we continue with our program. You are listening to Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. This is the Power of Reading program, and this is a book review program. I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice, from the Daughters of St. Paul, and today we continue our journey reviewing the book Body, Mind and Spirit, an Introduction to Christian Psychology. Let us just move on to chapter 6 and have an overview of this chapter that talks about growth. And our author tells us that growth is a characteristic of all living things. Although we have so far dealt in this book mainly with the structures of the human person, we realize that growth is something that happens in most of creation. That's what the author tells us. And of course, this growth is very, very important because the growth of the human person actually begins in the womb at conception. And this is where we start to grow within our mother's womb. And this has an effect in what our life will be, because if our mother is happy, joyful, and contented about our conception, that also has an effect on us. If she is not, or she is sickly, or she has some other issues, is also passed on to the person. So the growth that happens in the womb is also affected by the factors that are surrounding it. He talks about the second birth, and he calls it the moving independently, whereby when we were born, we realize that we are separate from our parent, especially the mother. Before we were together, we were existing in the same environment with our mothers, and we realized that this time we are an independent entity slowly and slowly. Then he talks about the third birth, that is entering the peer group. And this, of course, in our modern society today, we experience this when we go to school. The day comes when we are old enough to begin attending school. Again, this becomes a new world for us with new rules, new activities, new demands. And we are expected to behave and learn in much the same way as everyone else. We are no longer that special child born in a special family. We realize that we belong to a larger group. And this is where we are introduced actually to the world. We are introduced to different things that are not maybe present in our own families. He also talks about the fourth birth. And the fourth birth, he calls it the sexual person. And this is the time of changes, especially at puberty, at teenage time, when a person has a new awareness, a new consciousness of who or she is. And again, this stage is affected by the surrounding factors. If the person is helped to understand their sexuality, the changes they are going through, the person is going to have a very good, smooth movement. But if that doesn't work, our author tells us then the person is going to have some challenges that are going to happen later in life. So all these stages, they determine the growth of the person. And actually, our author, Brother Fergus Garrett, uses the explanation given about the stages of life by the famous psychologist Erik Erikson, who describes 8 stages of human development and their specific tasks. So I'm not going to go through these stages. I hope that you shall be able to get this book and be able to look at this. And he says these growth patterns, these stages of growth have their own purpose. They have their own part to play. In enumerating these stages, actually what the psychologist Erik Erikson is trying to do is just trying to help us to identify what happened at the different stages of our growth and to see what we may need to remedy just in case the purpose of that stage was not achieved when we were actually going through that stage, because this can help us to live a healthier life, a better life, a more positive life in our adulthood. And also maybe to deal with certain challenges that we might face in our life, certain characteristics, especially negative tendencies that we may have, we can be able to trace them in those stages of growth. Actually, the author also in the area of growth, he talks about born again. And this is what is commonly called conversion, which is a response to a call from God. And he says also, as a human being, even if we grow physically, we grow emotionally, there's also this growth that takes place in terms of our spiritual life, because we are also spiritual being. Of course, we are taught about religion in our childhood, we know something about God, but there is that moment in life that we make a decisive decision that we are going to live deeply our Christian faith and how we are going to live it in spite of what others have told us. Of course, he also says in the area of growth, he talks about searching for myself. So there is this levels of identification or self-understanding, which is a maturing person passes through, and that corresponds to the deeper levels of the self. So also there is this quest in a person to understand, who am I? Am I just the career I have? Am I just a male or a female? Am I just the clothes I wear? Who am I? What do I stand for? What values attract me? And sometimes these questions come when we face certain challenges, certain difficulties, or when we have to make certain choices in life. Even if one wants to get married, one has to have that deep self-awareness so that they can be able to understand what type of person they would want to share their life with. Also, in the area of growth, the author also deals with the issue of human needs. He talks about our human needs. And of course, our human needs are very, very important. And here he also distinguishes between needs and wants, because needs are things we cannot do without. We cannot do without oxygen. We cannot do without other people. We cannot do without love and certain things like that. We cannot even do without food. But there are wants. Even when we are looking at food, there is food for sustainability. There is food we may take not just for sustainability, but also for even pleasure. And actually, in this chapter 5, he has put a very long list of some of the psychological needs that have been identified as things that we need as human beings and what we feel that we need to have so that we can grow. And sometimes we are not aware ourselves of these needs. I love this list. I cannot read all of it because I think there are about 30. And these needs, he says, we do not have these needs at the same level as human beings. Some of us have these needs at a higher level. Some of us have it at a lower level. For example, he talks about we have the needs of achievement. Everyone wants to succeed. They want to progress. People have the needs for acquisition of a bit of property, possessions to be able to survive. There's a need for affiliation, being close with other people, to have a two-way relationship, having friends. There's need for autonomy, getting free. There's need for change, to be able to alter certain circumstances that are not favoring our growth or our welfare. There's a need for defending ourselves to make sure that we are not wounded or we don't fall apart. So he lists a lot of this. So these are also things that we need to understand as part of our growth. And of course, he talks about growth is also part of what we call our moral growth. There's what we call moral development. So that from our childhood, we should be helped to grow, to understand what is acceptable, what is permissible, what is respectful. That is our moral development. And of course, there is faith development. And this is a way of looking at life, a way of knowing and interpreting our experience. And it is not something we do, a way of thinking or acting. Because Christian faith especially is a gift, and most faith is a gift, is a grace. And because it is a gift and a grace, our faith development is based on our openness, our generosity. It is based on how we are able to receive the gift. We cannot do faith. We cannot plant faith in ourselves. And these are things that also affect our human growth. Chapter 7, he deals with motivation. As every human being is motivated by something. Whatever we do, whatever we choose, there is a motivation. And he says that actually he can see this issue of motivation even in the Gospels. He said that Jesus said, where your treasure is, there also will your heart be. This we find it in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21. For treasure, we can substitute that word treasure with values. And even we can even substitute it with the heart, means that the desires we have, the will, the motivation, it is the core self. Understanding of what motivates me will help me to see clearly where I should grow or change. And of course, he says this knowing is also based somehow on what Jesus says in John chapter 8, verse 32. You will know the truth and the truth will set you free. So he says that In this chapter of motivation, he wants to make use of the 4 levels of activity, because the human being is engaged in certain activity in understanding themselves. He talks about experience is one of the activities that makes us to know ourselves, the experiences we go through. Understanding, that is being able to reflect on our experiences. The judgments we make, immediately we see something, we experience something, we know if it is a positive or a negative, or if we want it or not. And also the decisions that we take, because once we take a decision, it becomes part of who we are and it can affect us. Then, of course, he talks about the 2 innate tendencies, that is towards evaluation and towards action. Sometimes we have those tendencies, either we evaluate a situation or we act in reference to that situation. And of course, the notion of importance, that is what is important for me, because that determines our motivation. What is important for me? But that is not enough, but also what is important in itself. For example, when we say, my life is very sacred to me, is very important to me, it is important to me, that statement. But we know that there is a greater statement than that, to say that every human life is sacred. So the sacredness of life is something that is important in itself. Then he talks about the non-intentional or unconscious states. So there's some things that happen to us. We don't intend them because they happen from our unconscious self. And here we talk about instincts, fatigue, irritability, anxiety, hunger, thirst, sexual tension. So these are not things, you cannot decide with your mind you are going to be hungry. If you have eaten 3 plates of food, you'll be full as long as that food is being assimilated and digested in your body. So there are things that are non-intentional and they are unconscious. And of course, the last 2 points, that is the notion of importance and the notion of non-intentional and unconscious states. These ones describe the sources of our psychic energy and force which direct our energy. So in this chapter, he talks about what is important. And this is very, very important as part of this book, because it talks with issues of truth, justice, service. And even he talks about levels of living, because we can just live at a physical level. As long as I eat, as much as I eat, that's what I live for. Some people live on the psychological level only. I get what I want. I seek all the attention I want. Some people live only on the spiritual level. No, it's just me and my prayer. But actually, a balanced person needs to live at all the levels, both physical, emotional, spiritual, even moral, so that you are a balanced person. You're a balanced person. Of course, when we act, when we do things, sometimes we don't do things separately at all these levels. But sometimes some of us emphasize some parts or some levels of living and neglect the others. And of course, that creates a kind of a dichotomy, a discrepancy, a kind of unbalance in our life, according to our author, Brother Fergus Garrett, in this book, Body, Mind, and Spirit. And of course, in this chapter 7, that deals with motivation, he also talks about our needs, our emotional desires. He even gives examples. He also talks about values and rational desires, because also there are desires that emanate from our minds. He talks about our attitudes, very important again, and also our habits. Our attitudes and our habits are very, very much connected. So we are going to take another break. We are going to take another break as we come and see what our author is sharing with us in chapter 8 in areas of self-knowledge and self-acceptance. You are listening to Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home, and the program is The Power of Reading. You are listening to the Power of Reading program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice, and it's my great joy to continue sharing with you our book, Body, Mind, and Spirit. Body, Mind, and Spirit, an introduction to Christian psychology. And this is the second program where we are reviewing this book. And now let us look at what our author is telling us in chapter 8 of this book that deals with our body, our mind, and our spirit. In chapter 8, the author introduces the topic of self-knowledge and self-acceptance. And this is also a chapter that he gives a lot of emphasis because he says our human nature possesses an innate tendency to go beyond my actual self towards an ideal self. This is not bad in itself, but it is not enough for us to always think what we would want to be, but also to be completely aware of who we are. And he says that one of the ways that can help us to grow in our self-knowledge, our self-acceptance, is to cultivate a habit of what he calls listening to myself. Listening to myself. He says that we need to develop this listening to oneself each day, seeing what is happening, especially in the inside, not what is happening outside of us. Of course, that is also important, but in terms of self-knowledge and self-acceptance, our author tells us this is listening of what is happening inside. This is to deal with issues of feelings, emotions, desires, and they are things that tell us who we are, what our desires are, and how we react to life. And he says, actually, this listening to ourselves can even be done at the end of the day and in a spirit of prayer. Because first, we should become aware of God's presence and ask Him for guidance to know the truth about ourselves and for courage to accept the truth. So we go through this examining how we have lived the day, the way we have reacted to different situations, because that will help us to know who we are. The author encourages us to look carefully at the circumstances and motives from which we seem to be acting, reacting, or responding to the situation. So this is where we sit. Sometimes we do remember the more strong moments during the day, maybe a very joyful moment, somebody brought you a gift or brought you good news, and the reaction you had to that. Sometimes it could be something negative. Maybe you had an argument with a spouse, with a friend, with a family member, with a workmate, or even they irritated you even without any verbal discussion. And we see ourselves how we react and even try to understand how we act that way. Actually, this is not the time of accusation and counter-accusation. Maybe the person was wrong. Here is to try to understand yourself, because sometimes some things that may make one very angry, they may be not a problem to somebody else. Or maybe what may make you so happy or make you laugh your heart off and out, for somebody else it may not seem funny. And he says one of the way of growing through self-knowledge and self-acceptance is actually through this examination of oneself, and he calls it listening to myself. That means if I'm listening to myself, actually I'm not condemning myself. It's not a moment of flogging myself. I shouldn't have done that. I was so dumb or stupid to have answered this way. It's just to listen to myself. It's just like you're imagining yourself, you're in the presence of a counselor or a very loving person who can be able to carry the burdens with you. He also encourages in this listening to oneself, if it is possible, to write down in a journal the discoveries we make. And a journal is not actually a diary which records outside events. It is a record of exploration of my inside, what I have experienced. Actually, it should be a very private book to the person. And of course, the author talks about the courage to acceptance. We have really to accept ourselves. Sometimes we are our greatest critics. And he actually cites quite a number of biblical passages where we see Jesus receiving even sinners and showing them such great love to show them that there is great value in them. They are not defined by their sinfulness. He also quotes even Prophet Isaiah, where the Lord says, "You are precious in my eyes, I love you," Isaiah 43:4, or "Do not be afraid, I will help you," what we find in Isaiah 41, verse 1 to 13. So actually he talks about this acceptance. The courage for acceptance is also a gift from God. We accept ourselves because God himself accepted us first. And again, in this area of self-knowledge, self-acceptance, he says we should also be attentive to the choices we make. We have to make choices so that we make sure that our self-knowledge grows. But this self-knowledge is not just for its own sake. It's a self-knowledge that is supposed to lead us to a kind of conversion, to a kind of living a better life, a more joyful life, and how actually we can act on whatever we have decided to change, so that also we don't end up pretending and we keep on falling back to the same mistakes or the same irrational things that we may find ourselves doing. He also talks about conversion. And of course, this is a progressive process. He says for some of us, conversion is more submission and compliance. Others is imitation and identification. But the best way to convert is what we call internalization, a total transformation of the person in terms of what we think, how we see life, how we approach life, how we look at life. In chapter 9, our author introduces us to the issues of being created, the sexual being. The sexual being in its completeness actually is male and female. A woman alone is not a complete human person, and a male alone is not complete. There's that completeness. Some people call it, we complement each other, the two genders. And he says this is something that it is so important for us to understand, because it puts everything else into the proper perspective in terms of things like marriage, things like working together, issues even about exploiting or abuse of women or men that is happening even today. We realize that we are there to complement each other, and there is no possibility of having new human life without male or female. And he says this is something that we really need to understand. Of course, he goes into deep biology here, what it really means to be female and male from physical, biological point of view, how that is determined and what it means. And of course, he goes also into the areas of masculine and feminine, the differences between a woman and a man, and how that works out also in terms of how we interact and how we live in the society. Because we know that the way a woman expresses their feelings is very different from how a man could express the same feelings. And of course, he goes also through the whole area of sexual feelings and emotions, and all those kind of things that are also very, very important in our interacting and even in our growth. And of course, when he talks about sexuality, he also has a subtopic on the whole area of psychosexual maturity, because sexuality is also something that we are called to grow in to maturity, because we can approach our sexuality in a very immature way, as something that needs to be explored or as something that is just for having fun, but there's something deeper than that in our lives. So he talks about that, and that is also a very beautiful topic, especially in our today's world where we experience a lot of negative vibes towards our sexuality. And of course, he talks about marriage and celibacy. Sometimes we think marriage and celibacy are two opposite things, but marriage and celibacy actually have the same end, because they are both concerned with the sanctity of life. They are both concerned with giving service. Marriage is also a sacrament of service. Celibacy is also for service. It's not for itself. So he also deals with that whole area, and he does it in such a beautiful way. So this is one of the books. Of course, as I said last week when I was introducing this book, it's not one of the simplest books to read. But these are some of the topics sometimes we need to deal with in a deeper way. Because sometimes, of course, we talk about sexuality in a very superficial way. But we know that life sometimes is not so simplistic. We need more information to be able to make informed choices. So this book really, I would encourage anyone who has at least done their secondary school education and are able to read, they can be able to read and really grow and help other people to grow. This is also a book that can be read in pairs or in a group or even between a couple, a husband and a wife, and have a bit of sharing. Because as we saw last week, the author told us at the end of some of the topics, he gives some exercises, some questions that can help us deepen what we are reading. And the beauty of this book is it deals with the human person. These are experiences that we go through as human beings. Chapter 10, the author brings in the whole area of relationships. And he says the human person is a being in the world with others. So as human beings, we are not islands. We are in relation. We are social beings. And we are aware in some way that we are related to every other object in creation. Of course, we are related to each other in a special way, but everything that is there in creation, we are related to it. Even the air we breathe, we have a relationship with that air because it helps us in one way or the other. And here also the author, in terms of helping us to understand how we relate with each other, brings in some of the dynamics that are used by psychologists, and he uses what we call the personality types. The personality types are the kind of orientations that help us to see the different ways we can behave as human beings. Of course, I would have loved to say more about this book. I hope you are going to get a copy for yourself. Body, Mind, and Spirit, An Introduction to Christian Psychology is a book we would really, really recommend because it's a book that takes us into another level. And this book can be found in any of the Pauline bookshops or any of the Catholic bookshops in your country. And also you can be able to buy this book online by visiting the Pauline's bookshop online, by visiting www.paulinesafrica.org. And this book can also be shipped to you. It's also a book I would really encourage you to give to your family, to your friends. It's a book you can share in different cycles. It's a pleasant book, and it's even a book that people who are not even Christians can be able to use. So thank you, dear listener, for being with us in our program today, The Power of Reading. I still encourage you to continue reading. Let us continue journeying in this world of books so that we can grow in our faith and grow also in our self-knowledge. And I take this opportunity with great pleasure to thank Mr. Timothy Mureithi, who faithfully records for us this Power of Reading program at Pauline's Studio, Nairobi. Thank you very much, Mr. Mureithi. And for all of you who have been following us in this program, thank you. I've been your host, Sister Beatrice, and until next week, may God bless you all.
You have been listening to the Power of Reading program. Join us next week as we continue discovering the wonderful world of books. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.